The compound sat 2 ridgelines away, and Ray Stapleton had been watching it come apart in slow pieces since before the sun cleared the eastern rock. She lay behind a dry berm of scree and packed earth, her spotting scope steady on a beam she had already decided was going to be a problem, and when the radio crackled with the voice of a man who did not know her name yet, she did not so much as blink. "Range control, be advised, we do not have a qualified shooter on that hill. Whoever's up there is not cleared for this." Ray watched a goat pick its way across the compound's inner yard. She reached down without looking and thumbed the dust cap off her elevation turret. "Copy," she said. "Not cleared. Understood." The man on the other end could not see her mouth move, could not see that she had already ranged the far wall 3 separate ways, could not know that the thing on her hip had been checked twice before first light. He heard a woman say, "Understood," and decided that settled it. Below her, in the wadi that ran along the base of the ridge, 11 people who had walked into that compound at dawn were still inside it, and one of them was a man named Elias Wren, who had a daughter he had promised to call on a Sunday that was now 3 Sundays gone. Ray did not know his name yet, either. She knew there were 11. She had counted them in, and she had counted nobody out, and the number sat in her chest the way a stone sits in a shoe. The wind came up the face of the ridge and pushed grit against the left side of her jaw. She let it. She had learned a long time ago that you do not fight the thing that is already happening to you. You find out what it is doing, and you use it. If you are the kind of person who stays for the whole thing, the part where the shouting stops and a man who spent a morning calling her useless has to say her name into a radio because there is no one else left who can do what she can, then settle in wherever you are listening from tonight, whether that's a truck outside Denver or a kitchen in Manila. Because before the light goes gold on that ridge, you're going to watch this woman walk down off her hill, cross open ground nobody said she could cross, and carry a man out of a room the rest of them had already written off. Subscribe and stay to the end. The place she came from smelled of hot iron and river silt. Her grandfather ran a small foundry on the edge of a town nobody drove through on purpose, a low building of corrugated tin where he cast bells and grates and the occasional headstone plaque, and Ray had spent every summer of her childhood in the orange dark of that shop, learning to read heat the way other children learn to read books. He never explained a thing twice, but he was not a boss and he was not a foreman. He was her mother's father, a wide, quiet man named Amos, who wore the same leather apron for 30 years and taught her the trade because the trade was the only language he trusted. "Metal tells you what it's going to do before it does it," he told her once, both of them leaning over a crucible that glowed like a small sun. "You just have to be looking at the right part. Everybody watches where it's pouring. You watch where it's cooling. That's where the crack starts. That's where you'll get bit." She had been 14. She had not understood him for years. What she understood now, 20 years later on a foreign ridge, was the shape of the lesson underneath the words. You do not read a thing by its loudest part. You read it by the part that is quietly changing while everyone else stares at the fire. She had carried that out of the foundry and into a marksmanship school where the instructors could not figure out how a woman with no pedigree and a boring service record kept putting rounds through the same hole, and she had never told any of them about the bells. She was small. She had always been small, and she had spent her whole life watching people do the arithmetic on her before she opened her mouth. The quick down and up glance, the recalculation, the decision that whatever the room needed, it would have to come from somebody larger. She had stopped minding a long time ago. It was useful, mostly. People said things in front of a person they had already decided did not count. There was one thing she had not settled, and it had nothing to do with any of this. His name was Harlan Pace, and he had owned the hardware store 2 streets over from the foundry. And when Ray was 19 and her mother was sick and there was no money for the thing that might have helped, Harlan had come across the street one evening with an envelope and put it on the kitchen table and said something about a bulk order he'd overpaid on, a refund he had nowhere to put. It was a lie, and everyone at the table knew it was a lie. Her mother had lived another 6 years because of what was in that envelope. Harlan had never once mentioned it, not at the funeral, not at Christmas, not in the 15 years since. Ray had made staff sergeant's pay for most of a decade. She had the money 3 times over. She had a folded check in her wallet right now, soft at the creases from being carried, and every time she went home she found a reason not to walk it across the street, because the moment she handed it over, the debt would be a transaction, and as long as she carried it, it was still the largest kindness anyone had ever done her. She did not know how to make those two things be the same thing, so she carried the check. The unit she was attached to did not want her. It was a joint task force built around a special operations element that ran its own aviation and its own reconnaissance and had its own way of doing everything. And Ray had arrived as a line on a manifest, augmentee, precision, attached, and a line on a manifest is easy to skip. The man who made a project of skipping her was a sergeant named Bo Kettering, loud and genuinely good at his job, a shooter with a reputation and a following, and he decided within about an hour of meeting her that a woman that size on a long gun was a joke somebody upstairs had played on him. "You know what the wind does to 120 pounds behind a 14-pound rifle?" he said in the chow tent, loud, to the 4 men at his table and the whole tent besides. "It carries her off the gun. Recoil's gonna move her more than it moves the round. I've seen it. Some desk in the rear checks a box, and now she's on my range." Ray was 2 tables over eating rice and did not look up. One of Kettering's men laughed, then looked like he wished he hadn't. She let it sit for a moment. Then she said, to her rice, loud enough to carry, 14.5. Kettering turned. "What?" "The rifle. It's 14.5 pounds with the scope you're picturing. You lowballed it to make the point land better." She took a bite. "It's a good point, though. You should keep using it." Somebody choked on their coffee. Kettering's jaw worked. He went back to his table without a word, and that was the first time, the first of several, that a room decided she might be more than the line on the manifest. The person who figured her out for real did not do it with a joke. His name was Dieter Vall, a civilian armorer contracted to the task force, 60-some years old, been in that trade since before half the operators were born, and he had a way of watching a person's hands that most people never noticed. Ray had brought her rifle to his bench the second day because the bolt was gritty, and instead of handing it across the counter, she field-stripped it there in front of him without being asked, laid the parts out on the felt, in the order she'd take them up again, and cleaned the bolt carrier with the particular economy of someone who had done it 10,000 times and stopped thinking about it around the 2,000th. Vall watched her wipe the bolt face, hold it up to the light, turn it a quarter, wipe it again. "You're checking the extractor," he said. "Nobody checks the extractor." "My grandfather cast bells," she said, like that was an answer. To her it was. "You want to know if a bell's going to crack? You don't tap the middle. You tap the rim where it's thin." Vall looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled a stool over with his foot and sat down across the bench from her, and for the next 40 minutes the two of them talked about metal, about heat treatment and stress and the places where a thing fails first, and neither of them said one word about shooting, and it was the best conversation Ray had had in a year. When she packed up to go, he said, "Whatever's on that manifest about you is wrong," and she said, "Most of it," and he laughed. She could be easy company when she let herself. There was an evening 3 days before everything when a generator went down and the whole camp lost power to the tents, and Ray was the one who found the fault by feel in the dark, her hands walking the housing while 4 grown men held phone lights and argued about which relay it was. When the lights came back, she stood up wiping her hands and said, "It's always the thing nobody wants to check because checking it is annoying." And one of Kettering's own men, a kid named Sorrel, laughed so hard he had to sit down. After that, Sorrel started saving her a seat at chow, Kettering noticed. Kettering said nothing, which for Kettering was a great deal. Sorrel was the one who saw it, the thing he couldn't explain. They were on the range zeroing before the operation, and Ray was on a cold bore. First round of the day, no warmers, the hardest single shot there is, and she settled behind the gun and did not fuss and did not adjust for a long 30 seconds, and then she pressed the round off and it went exactly where the math said it should, and she came off the gun and started packing up like nothing had happened. Sorrel had been watching through a spotting scope. He looked at the target, then at her, then at the target. "How'd you know it'd hold?" he asked. Cold boar. Everybody chases the cold boar. Ray shrugged. I didn't chase it. I just knew where it was going to be. She said it the way you'd say the sky was up. Sorrel opened his mouth to ask something else and couldn't find the shape of it. There was a thing she had just done, and he had watched her do it, and he did not have the words for what it was. He carried that unsaid thing around for the next 2 days like a stone in his pocket. The world broke in the middle of a card game. They were 4 hands into a game nobody was taking seriously when the operations tent went from murmur to shout in the space of a breath, and a captain came out at a dead run looking for the task force commander, and inside 10 minutes the whole camp had rearranged itself around a single ugly fact. A partnered element. 11 people, a mix of American advisors and the local personnel they worked with, had gone into a walled compound at first light on what was supposed to be a meeting and had instead walked into a trap. The building was held. The 11 were pinned in an interior room with a single door and a courtyard between them and anywhere. The people holding the compound had the numbers and the angles and had made it clear they were in no hurry. 11. The number went around the camp and landed in everybody the same way. 11 people who had to come home, and every plan anybody floated in the first hour ended the same way. A breach through that courtyard under fire, and a butcher's arithmetic nobody wanted to say out loud. The commander was a colonel named Wade Thornberry, and he was the man who had let Ray stay a line on a manifest for 3 weeks, and he was the one who had to make the call. He found her at the edge of the operations tent where she'd come to stand when the shouting started. "Stapleton!" He said her name like it cost him something, and it did. There's a beam, structural, holding the courtyard side roof of the room they're in. The assault force can't get across that yard while there's a gun on it, and there's a gun on it, sitting up behind a parapet where nobody on the ground can range him. I've got shooters, I've got Kettering. He stopped, started again. I watched your book from the range this morning before I knew I'd need it. Cold boar, first round, no warmers, and you didn't chase it. I've been wrong about you for 3 weeks, and I don't have 3 weeks to be sorry about it. Can you make that hill? Ray was already looking east, toward the ridgeline, doing the arithmetic that was actually hers. How far is the shot? 1,400 meters, give or take. Then give me the hill, she said, and picked up her gear. 20 minutes later, prone behind the berm with the compound in her glass, she keyed her radio for the first time, and her voice came out flat and level and entirely without ceremony, nothing at all like a line on a manifest. All stations, this is Overwatch. I'm set on the high ground. I have eyes on the courtyard and the parapet. Hold what you've got. I'll tell you when the roofman stops being a problem. The operation did not go the way the plan wanted it to. The first thing that went wrong was the light. Ray had set up expecting the sun to be at her back through the morning, throwing the parapet into clean relief, but a high, thin haze had come up off the desert floor overnight and turned the whole sky into a diffuse white sheet, and now there were no shadows anywhere. The compound sat flat and depthless in her scope, every edge soft, the parapet gunman nothing but a suggestion of movement behind a lip of mud brick. She could not get a clean picture of him. She could see when he moved, and she could not see him still. Overwatch, assault. What have you got? Working it, she said. Hold. The second thing that went wrong was the gunman himself. He was not a fool. He fired in short, considered bursts, and then he changed his position along the parapet, sliding 2 meters left or right before he came up again, so that the place Ray had ranged and the place he next appeared were never the same place. She could not simply wait for him. She had to find him fresh every time, in a white sky with no shadows, at 1,400 meters, and each time she found him, he was already going back down. She talked herself through it the way her grandfather had taught her, out loud, low, under her breath. Watch where it's cooling, not where it's pouring. She was not watching the man. She was watching the parapet, the lip of it, the places where the mud brick was scuffed pale from a boot or a knee going up and down in the same spots. He was a creature of habit even when he was being careful. There were 3 pale patches. He came up at one of 3 places. She stopped hunting the whole wall and started watching 3 points. The third thing that went wrong nearly ended it. Down in the wadi, the assault force tried a movement. just a repositioning. Two men shifting to a better piece of cover. And the compound answered with everything it had. And for 90 seconds, the radio was a wall of noise, and Ray lay on her hill, listening to a firefight she could not join yet because the roofman had gone down behind his parapet and would not show. And then a voice she'd started to know cut through it. "Overwatch, this is Sorrel. We're pinned. We got a man down in the open. I say again, man down in the—" And then nothing. The channel went dead where Sorrel's voice had been. Ray keyed her radio. "Sorrel, Sorrel, say again. This is Overwatch. Say your status." Nothing. Static, and the flat white sky, and the far-off pop of weapons on different materials, the deep smack of rounds into mud brick, the sharper crack of them off stone. "Sorrel, this is Overwatch. Key your radio if you can hear me." Nothing. She counted in her head, 1, 2, 3. And every number was a small cold weight, and she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she had trained herself out of years ago, and she made herself breathe out slow and long because a heart rate is a thing you can override if you catch it early, at the rim, before the crack runs. 6 seconds. 7. She did not say his name again because saying it again would not bring it back, and it would tell everyone on the net how frightened she was. At 9 seconds, his radio keyed, and his voice came back thin and shaking. "Overwatch, still here. Cover's holding. We pulled him back. He's hit, but he's breathing." Ray let the air out of her chest. She had not known she was holding it. Then the commander's voice, tight. "Overwatch, that beam is going to take fire until the roof man is gone. We cannot cross that yard. What is your status on the parapet?" 3 pale patches, a white sky. A man who showed himself for a second and a half at a time. Ray settled deeper behind the gun and did the thing she was actually there to do, and put a round through the middle pale patch a quarter second after movement started there, and the parapet went quiet and stayed quiet. "Roofman's down," she said. "The beam's clear. Cross your yard." The 11 were still 11. She had counted nobody out, and now she watched through the haze the assault force flow across a courtyard that had been a killing ground 90 seconds before, and reach the door of the interior room, and start bringing people out. The man they brought out first could not walk. His name was Elias Wren, and he was one of the American advisors, and a piece of the compound had come down across his leg early in the fight, and pinned him long enough that by the time his people dragged him clear, the leg was wrong, in a way that meant he was not walking out of anywhere. They got him to the courtyard wall into a slice of shadow, and there was a corpsman working on him, but the corpsman was also working on 2 others, and the arithmetic of hands was against them. Up on her hill, Ray watched all of this through her scope, and she watched the compound too, because the fight was not over just because the roofman was. There were still shooters in the outbuildings. There were still angles onto that courtyard. And she watched a second gunman set up in a window on the compound's far side, a window she had a line to, and the men in the courtyard did not. And she settled the crosshair and pressed the round off, and the window went empty, and she said, "Second shooter, west building, down," and went back to watching. But there was a thing happening in the courtyard that her rifle could not fix, and she could see it happening, and it was the thing that made her do what she did next. Elias Wren was going into shock, and the corpsman knew it, and there were not enough hands, and the extraction bird could not come into the compound itself because the compound was not secure. It would have to land in the open ground beyond the west wall, and somebody was going to have to move Wren across 100 meters of ground that still had guns on it, and there was nobody free to do it, because every hand that could carry him was a hand that was also a gun holding the compound down. Ray keyed her radio. "Assault, Overwatch. The man against the courtyard wall. The leg. He's crashing. You've got nobody to move him, and the bird can't come to you. We know, Overwatch. We're working it. You're not working it. You're pinned holding what you've got, and if you peel a man off to carry him, you lose the west wall, and everybody in that courtyard's back in the open." A pause. "I'm coming down. Overwatch. Negative. You are not cleared to leave that." "I'm coming down," she said again, already moving, already breaking the rifle down onto her back, already sliding off the berm on her belly. "Somebody's got to be the hands. It's me. Watch the east ridge for me. That's the only angle onto the ground I'll be crossing. Watch it and tell me if it lights up." She came down off the hill. It took her 4 minutes to cover ground that had taken her 20 to climb, half of it on her feet and half of it on her belly, and every meter of it she was 120 pounds of person in the open where 3 weeks of men had told her she did not belong, and she did not think about any of that because there was no room in her for it. She thought about the ground. She thought about the one angle from the East Ridge that could see her and the fact that Sorrel's voice was on the net now calling out that ridge every 10 seconds. Clear. Still nothing. Still nothing. She reached the west wall of the compound with her lungs on fire and dropped into the shadow of it beside the corpsman and Elias Wren. And Wren's eyes found her face, and he was gray and far away, and he asked her the only question that mattered. "Am I going to make it?" Ray looked at the leg and looked at the 100 meters of open ground between the wall and the place the bird would come, and looked at Wren's face. "Yeah," she said. "Not a hope. A fact. You've got a daughter waiting on a phone call. You're going to make that call. That's not a maybe. Now hold on to me." Because he did have a daughter. He'd been talking about her, the corpsman said later, all through the worst of it, half-conscious and repeating that he'd promised to call her on Sunday and missed 3 of them, that she was starting a new job and scared of it, and he'd said he would call. He said it now, to Ray, thin and cracked. "Sunday. I said she's got her first day, and I said, then you'll call her Sunday," Ray said, getting her shoulder under his arm, taking the weight the way you take the weight of anything heavy, from underneath, close. Letting your legs do it and not your back. Hands where they'll do work, not where they'll get bit. Grandpa taught me that too. Wren didn't understand it. He didn't have to. She got him up. The compound was not going to let her have the 100 meters for free. There was a machine gun in the compound's northeast corner tower, and it had a clean line onto the open ground she had to cross, and the assault force could not get an angle on it from where they were pinned. And it was the reason nobody had been able to move Wren in the first place. It was, Ray understood now with total clarity, the actual problem, not the leg, not the hands, but this one gun in this one tower that turned 100 meters of dirt into a place people died. Her rifle could not solve it. She could not be on her hill and be Wren's hands at the same time, and she had chosen to be the hands, and now she was down here at ground level where the tower had every advantage and she had none. She keyed her radio, crouched against the wall with Wren's weight already on her. "Overwatch to any station. That northeast tower gun is the whole problem, and I'm out of position to take it. I need somebody to buy me the west crossing. Who's got an angle?" A silence. Not a dead radio silence, a thinking silence, men doing arithmetic. And then the voice that came back was the last one she expected, and it came back slow, and it came back like every word cost him a tooth. "Overwatch. A pause you could have driven a truck through. 3 seconds, 4. This is Kettering." The whole net was listening. Everyone who had heard him in the chow tent, everyone who had heard him call her a joke somebody played, every one of them was on this channel now, and Kettering knew it, and he keyed the radio anyway, and he said the thing that cost him everything. "I can't take that tower from where I am, but I can make it look at me instead of you." Another pause. "Stapleton, I need you to run when I tell you and not 1 second before, because I'm going to stand up in the open and put every round I've got into that tower's firing slit, and it is going to shoot back at me, and while it's shooting at me, it isn't shooting at you. You copy? You run when I say run." There it was, her name in his mouth on the open net, and underneath it the plainest and most expensive thing a man like Bo Kettering could offer. "I will stand up in the open and be the target so you can be the hands." He did not have to. Nobody would have known if he'd stayed down. He was going to do the thing she was not free to do, and he was going to do it in front of everyone who had watched him dismiss her. "I copy," Ray said. "On your call. Ready. A breath. Run." And Bo Kettering stood up out of cover into the open ground with a rifle at his shoulder and started putting round after round through the firing slit of that tower gun. The sharp, flat crack of his rifle, over and over, deliberate, unhurried, a man making himself impossible to ignore. And the tower gun swung off the open ground and onto him and opened up, and the air between them filled with noise, and in the half-second the gun turned away, Ray came out from the wall with 180 pounds of Elias Wren across her back, and she ran. She ran the way you run when the running is the only thing. Head down, legs under the weight, boots finding the ground by feel. The world narrowed to the next stride and the strip of dirt in front of it. She heard the tower gun hammering off to her right, heard it walking rounds toward Kettering and away from her, heard Kettering's rifle answering it flat and steady, and she heard Sorrel on the net screaming that the east ridge was clear, clear, keep going, and she ran through all of it with a man on her back and her grandfather's voice somewhere underneath saying, "You take the weight from below." And the ground came up under her one stride at a time until the low shape of the extraction bird resolved out of the haze ahead of her, and hands reached out of it to take the weight off her back. They got Wren aboard. Ray turned, still in the open, and looked back at the tower and keyed her radio. "He's on the bird, Kettering. Get down, you loud son of a... Get down." And Bo Kettering dropped back into cover a half-second before the tower gun chewed the dirt where he'd been standing, and lived. Ray reported it in the flattest language she owned. She got herself back to the west wall and into cover and picked her rifle back up off her own back, and she settled behind it in an improvised position against the mud brick, and she found the northeast tower's firing slit in her scope, and she put a round through it, and the tower gun stopped. She keyed her radio. "Overwatch. Northeast tower is down. Package is on the bird and moving. West crossing is clear." She let off the key, then keyed it again. "Recommend you finish clearing while I've got the angle. I'm not going anywhere." That was all. There was no music in it. A man had just stood up in the open to save her the crossing, and she had run 100 meters under a machine gun with a dying man on her back, and the words she chose for it were package and crossing and angle, and the flatness of it against everything underneath was the whole of what she had left to give. Nobody on the net said anything for a moment. Then the commander's voice, quiet, "Copy, Overwatch, finish it." She finished it. The rest of the compound came apart over the next 20 minutes, room by room, and Ray covered it from her position at the wall, and the number that had sat in her chest all morning finally started to move the right direction, the 11 coming out in ones and twos across the west crossing she and Kettering had bought onto birds, out, 11 in, 11 out. Elias Wren the only one on a stretcher, and Elias Wren breathing. It was only when it was over, when the last of them was clear and the compound was silent and somebody said, "Stand down over the net," that Ray noticed her hands. She was trying to seat the dust cap back on her elevation turret, and she could not do it, because her hands had started to shake, hard, the fine tremor of a body finally allowed to feel what it had been through, and she sat there against the wall with her back to the mud brick, and let them shake and did not try to stop them, because there was nobody to see, and the shaking was allowed now. Sorrel found her there. He didn't say anything. He sat down next to her against the wall, close, and after a while he took the dust cap out of her shaking fingers and seated it on the turret himself, and the two of them sat in the quiet. The review officer arrived 2 days later and could not make the paper agree with the woman. His name was Gerald Ashby, and he had flown in from a headquarters somewhere with a folder and a set of questions, because an augmentee not cleared for a precision overwatch role had conducted a precision overwatch engagement and then left her position to perform a casualty evacuation under fire. And there were boxes on forms that all of that violated, and it was Ashby's job to reconcile the record. He sat across a folding table from Ray in a plywood room and opened his folder. "Staff Sergeant Stapleton, your qualification record shows a standard augmentee marksmanship certification, no advanced sniper course, no formal high-angle or extended-range qualification." He looked up. "You engage targets at 1,400 meters in poor visibility. The record says you're not trained to do that." "The record's right," Ray said. "I'm not." Ashby blinked. I'm sorry. You're agreeing with me." "I'm not formally trained to that range, never went to the school." She folded her hands on the table. "I can still do it. Those are different sentences. That's not how qualification works." "It's exactly how it works. The school gives you a piece of paper that says you can do a thing. It doesn't give you the thing. I got the thing somewhere else." She leaned back. "You want to know where I got it? Ask. It's not in the folder because the folder doesn't have a box for a foundry." Ashby looked down at his folder and looked at her. And Ray watched him understand, slowly, that everything in front of him was accurate, and none of it described what had happened on that ridge. He had a record that said one thing and a compound full of survivors that said another, and the two of them were both true, and his entire job assumed they couldn't be. The casualty evacuation, he tried. You left an overwatch position. That's against procedure. Yeah, she nodded. There was a man crashing and no hands to move him, and a gun on the only ground the bird could use. I made a call. If you've got a box that says I should have stayed on my hill and let him die by the book, I'll sign it, and then I'll do the exact same thing next time. She said it without heat. You can write me up for the whole thing. I'll sign every line. But you flew a long way to find out whether the person matches the paper, and I'm telling you plain, she doesn't. She never did. That's not a discrepancy you're going to close with me sitting here. You're going to have to decide it's all right that she doesn't. Ashby closed the folder. He sat for a long moment. Then he said quietly, The advisor, Wren, he's going to keep the leg. I read it this morning. Good, Ray said, and for the first time in the interview, something moved in her face. The night after the review, she said the thing to Kettering she had not said to anyone. They ended up on the same stretch of HESCO barrier outside the operations tent, past midnight, neither of them sleeping, and for a while, neither of them spoke. There was a generator running somewhere, and the low sound of it filled the space where talking would go. Kettering had a leg stretched out in front of him. Ray sat with her knees up and her arms around them. I keep hearing the 9 seconds, she said finally. She hadn't planned to. It came out of the dark on its own. When Sorrell's radio went out, between him saying man down and his radio coming back, 9 seconds. I've been counting it in my sleep. I counted it in the review this afternoon, right in the middle of Ashby's questions. 9 seconds. And I couldn't do anything but lie there and count and not say his name, because saying his name would have told everybody how scared I was. She pressed her mouth to her knees. I've done this a long time. I'm not supposed to still get the 9 seconds. Kettering was quiet for a while. When he spoke, it wasn't what she expected. I called you a joke, he said. In the chow tent, first day, in front of everybody. He turned his head and looked at her in the dark. You want to know the truth? I clocked what you were the second day when Vol pulled a stool over. Vol doesn't pull a stool over for anybody. I saw it, and I doubled down anyway because I'd already said it loud and I didn't know how to take it back without looking like... He stopped. Started again. The 9 seconds. You want to know why you still get the 9 seconds after all this time? Because you count. Because there's a number in your chest and it's people. The day you don't get the 9 seconds is the day the number stops being people to you, and you do not want that day, Stapleton. I've met the guys who got to that day. You don't want to be one. He looked back out at the dark. You're not broken. You're just still keeping count. That's the job. That's the whole job. Ray didn't say anything for a long time, but something in her chest, some old braced thing, let go by about an inch. She decided about the check on a Tuesday in the plywood room, with nobody's help. The folded check had been in her wallet the whole time. Through the ridge, through the crossing, through the review, and after Kettering said the thing about keeping count, she'd started turning Harlan Pace over in her mind at odd hours, and she understood at last that she'd had the debt backward the entire time. She had been carrying it like a thing she couldn't resolve because resolving it would make it smaller. But that was her arithmetic, not Harlan's. Harlan hadn't put an envelope on the table to buy a 15-year monument to his own kindness. He'd done it because her mother was sick and there was money for the thing that might help, and he had the money and they didn't, and it was, to him, the simplest transaction in the world. Metal tells you what it's going to do before it does it. You just have to be looking at the right part. She'd been watching the wrong part of Harlan Pace for 15 years. She'd been watching the grand unpayable kindness. The part that was actually true was smaller and plainer. A man had helped a neighbor, and the neighbor's kid had grown up and could pay it back now. And paying it back wasn't shrinking anything. It was just the next true thing. Nobody handed her that. No stranger from the same town. No letter, no chance encounter. She just sat in a plywood room 10,000 miles from that street. and did the arithmetic that was actually hers, and got a different answer than she'd been getting for 15 years. She took the check out of her wallet. She looked at it, soft at the creases. Then she got a pen and a fresh envelope from the admin tent, and she wrote across the top of a sheet of paper, in her plain hand, "Harlan, I've known for 15 years it wasn't a refund. Thank you for lying about it so I'd take it. Here's what I owe you, and it doesn't make us even because that kind of thing doesn't work that way, and I finally figured out it was never supposed to." She folded the check inside it. She sealed it. She wrote the address from memory because she had known it her whole life, and she put it in the outgoing mail, and the debt she'd carried for 15 years walked out of her hands, and she found that it was lighter to be without it than she'd spent 15 years being afraid it would be. The reckoning with Kettering happened where nobody could see it, which was the only way he could do it. He came and found her at Vol's bench of all places 3 days later. She was cleaning her rifle again, the ritual of it, and Vol had made himself scarce the way an old man does when he can feel a thing coming. Kettering stood there for a while with his hands in his pockets and watched her check the extractor, and then he took his hands out of his pockets and put them at his sides like a man reporting for something. "I stood up in front of that tower because I owed you," he said. "That was the debt. That was me trying to pay it with my body because I'm better at that than at this." He gestured vaguely at the space between them, at the thing that had to be said with words. "But a man told me once you don't get to skip the part that's hard for you just because you did the part that's easy, so." He took a breath, and it visibly cost him, and when he spoke again, it came out in pieces. "I was wrong about you. Loud and in front of people, so it's got to be loud and in front of— No, there's nobody here. That's the point. I need to say it where there's nobody, so you know I'm not saying it for them." He stopped, started over. "I was wrong. I looked at 120 pounds, and I decided I knew the whole story, and I was wrong about every part of it, and I said so where it could hurt you, and I'm sorry. That's it. That's the whole thing. I'm sorry." Ray set the bolt down on the felt. She looked at him for a moment. "You stood up," she said. 3 words. Not "I forgive you," which would have been cheap, and not "you should be sorry," which would have been a punishment, and Kettering was owed neither. Just the plainest true thing between them. You stood up. He'd made himself the target so she could be the hands. Everything he'd said in the chow tent was real, and everything he'd done at that wall was also real, and she was choosing to build on the second one. He heard it. His jaw worked once, and he nodded, and he picked up a rag off Vol's bench and started helping her clean, and neither of them said anything else, and it was enough. Elias Wren's sister called her on a Sunday, weeks later. Ray was back stateside by then on the phone in a hallway, and a woman's voice she didn't know said, "Is this Ray Stapleton? The one who— My brother's Elias Wren. He gave me this number. I hope that's okay." And Ray said it was okay. And there was a silence on the line, and then the woman started to cry, and it was not delicate crying, it was the big helpless kind, and through it she was trying to say something and couldn't get it out, and Ray stood in the hallway holding the phone and had absolutely no idea what to do with any of it. "He carried me," the woman finally got out. I know that's not what happened. I know it was you that carried him, but that's how it feels. He's my only— Our folks are gone. It's just us, and if you hadn't— I've been trying to figure out what you say to a person who— There isn't a thing you say, is there? There's no— I looked. I tried to think of the thing, and there isn't one." "There doesn't have to be a thing," Ray said, which was the only true sentence she could find. "He called his daughter," the woman said. "The Sunday after. First thing he did when he could hold a phone. Called her right on her first day at the new job, told her he was proud, told her he'd been thinking about her the whole— She had to stop. She'd been so scared of that job. He'd promised to call, and he kept missing it, and she'd stopped expecting it. And then he called. Because of you, he called." Ray leaned her head back against the hallway wall and closed her eyes and did not trust herself to say anything at all. She had answered a dying man's question with a fact. You're going to make that call. And here was the fact, come all the way back around, in the voice of a woman she'd never met who couldn't stop crying. She said finally, "I'm real glad he made the call." It was so far short of what the moment held that it was almost funny, and both of them knew it, and neither of them minded. Wade Thornberry changed her standing in his own words. He did it in front of the assembled task force before Ray rotated home, and he did not dress it up. He stood in front of the formation and said, 3 weeks ago, I had a shooter on my manifest, and I let her sit there as a line of text because I read her the way a lot of you read her, which is to say I didn't read her at all. Then I needed a 1,400-meter shot in white light with no shadows and a casualty nobody could move, and the person who did both of those things was the line of text I'd been ignoring. He looked at Ray, standing at the edge of the formation. Staff Sergeant Stapleton is being recommended for assignment to this task force's precision element as a permanent member, not an augmentee, and the recommendation is signed by me, and I want it on the record that I'm the man who almost didn't. He paused. I was wrong. I'm the one who was supposed to know better, and I was wrong. That's on me, out loud, so it's said. It wasn't the room standing up. That would come, in its own way, later and quieter. This was a colonel owning a thing in front of the men who'd watched him not own it, and changing a line on a manifest into a name on a roster, and it cost him to do it plain like that, and he did it anyway. Sorrel found the words at last on the flight line the morning she left. He'd been carrying the unsayable thing around since the range, the thing he'd watched her do to a cold bore and couldn't name, and he'd clearly been working on it, because when he came up to her on the flight line, he had the look of a man who'd finally gotten hold of a slippery thought. I figured out what it was, he said, on the range, the cold bore, why I couldn't say it. He squinted into the sun. Everybody I ever watched shoot, they're fighting the gun a little, fighting the wind, fighting the cold barrel, fighting something. You can see it in 'em, this little argument going on. And you, he shook his head. You weren't arguing with anything. You looked at the whole situation and you just agreed with it. Whatever it was already going to do, you got there first and agreed with it, and then you shot. That's the thing I couldn't say. You don't fight it. You get there first. He looked almost relieved to have it out. That's the whole difference, isn't it? That's everything. Yeah, Ray said and smiled, because he'd gotten it exactly, better than the school could have said it, better than she could have said it herself. That's everything. Took me 20 years in a foundry. You got it in 2 days. I had a good thing to watch, Sorrel said. A year and a half later, the pieces of it had scattered out into lives that kept going. Ray was at a range in the high desert running a relay of new precision students through a cold bore exercise, civilian contract work now, and the thing the operation had left her with was still with her, and she had built her whole day around it without ever once saying what it was. She counted. She'd always counted, but now she counted everything, out loud, under her breath, all day long. Students on the line, rounds in the magazine, the seconds between a radio call and its answer. A low, steady murmur of numbers that the other instructors had noticed and were kind enough never to mention, because they'd all heard some version of the story and figured a woman was entitled to keep whatever count she needed to keep. She caught herself doing it and didn't stop. 9 was the number she never let a silence reach. If she called a student on the line and didn't hear back, she was moving before 4, and the students thought she was just fast, and she let them think it. Bo Kettering ran the range next to hers. He'd left the service around the same time she had and turned up at the same contract outfit, and the two of them had a standing thing where he'd wander over at the end of the day and help her break down the line, cleaning gear side by side the way they had at Vol's bench, not saying much. He was quieter than he'd been. The loud had gone out of him somewhere over the years and left something better behind. He still couldn't quite look at her when the count got audible, but he never told her to stop. Elias Wren sent a photograph once. It came in an envelope with no note, because Wren wasn't a man of many words either, and it was a picture of him standing at a kitchen counter with a phone to his ear and a grin on his face, and a young woman beside him laughing at something, and on the back, in pencil, it just said Sunday. He'd kept the leg. He walked with a stick and he called his daughter every Sunday without fail, the sister had told Ray, every single Sunday, a man who'd learned exactly what a missed one cost. The theme of the whole thing, if it had one, Ray said out loud exactly once to a student who was chasing a cold bore and fighting it and losing. Stop arguing with it, she told him, crouched beside him on the line. You keep trying to make the shot into what you want it to be. Look at what it already is. The barrel's cold. The wind's doing what it's doing. The light is what it is. None of that's a problem to solve. It's just the truth of the thing. Get there first, agree with it, then shoot. The student settled and stopped fighting, and the round went where it was always going to go, and he looked up at her like she'd done a magic trick, and she shook her head. No magic. I just watched where it was cooling instead of where it was pouring. Somebody taught me that a long time ago. She stood up and brushed the dust off her knees. He cast bells. She left something behind that outlived the moment, and it wasn't the shot. The new students, the ones who came through her relays, they all picked it up without quite knowing they were picking it up. The way she read a situation by its quiet edges instead of its loud middle. The way she agreed with a thing before she acted on it. Years from now, some of them would be teaching it to people who'd never heard her name, saying, "Get there first," saying, "Watch where it's cooling," not knowing they were passing along a foundryman's lesson about bells that a small woman had carried off a white-skied ridge and out across 100 meters of open ground with a man on her back. That was the thing that would outlast all of it. Not the 1,400-meter shot, the way of seeing. She was back on the ridge, in a manner of speaking, a different ridge, a range berm in the high desert, but she set up on it the same way, prone behind the gun with the whole valley laid out flat and honest in front of her in the early light. The morning haze was burning off. The students were coming up the line behind her. She thumbed the dust cap off her elevation turret the way she'd done it 10,000 times, the way she'd done it that morning, 2 ridge lines from a compound full of people who all came home, and she settled behind the gun level, eyed and easy, at peace with the barrel and the wind and the light and the count running quiet under her breath, and she waited for the thing to tell her what it was going to do so she could get there first and agree with it.